So the goal of this video is to be a little more down to earth and try to make the case for God's existence in a way that you may not have heard. You can actually take the type of argument that I usually use, which I call the transcendental argument. I'm going to shy away from a lot of fancy philosophical terms. We'll have to use a few, but we're going to look them up. But you can actually retool this argument, or you can actually modify it to use a lot of different philosophical or logical principles to prove the necessity of a certain type of God, not just any kind of generic God, but a specific kind of God. And we'll get to that later. But first, what I want to talk about is how would I go about making an argument for God's existence that you have never heard, given that we've been debating this for centuries. People have looked around and we've not really seen any new arguments for God's existence, or actually, have we? In the domain of philosophy, you have certain paradigm level issues or paradigm definers that make any philosophy what they are, any worldview what they are. That's the domain of ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. So, in other words, morals, right and wrong. Metaphysics is just a fancy term for what exists and doesn't exist. And then epistemology is our theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Do we have good reasons for what we think we know? Can we justify, give an account for, and ground our beliefs? Now, if you get into philosophy, one of the first things that you're going to encounter is the idea of causation or causality, cause and effect. And for many centuries, excuse me, this was a very profound, seemingly convincing principle in metaphysics that could argue for or prove the existence of some kind of supreme, immaterial, non spatial first cause. This cause kind of maybe set the universe into motion and made it start ticking and, wound up the clock or whatever. But do we really know much about it? It's hard to say. Regardless, eventually the principle of causation, cause and effect, there's an event happening that, like a billiard ball hitting one and knocking another away, that this principle itself began to be doubted. In other words, could we actually see in the world a cause and effect, or are we just interpreting one event and another event and calling that causality? Now, I'm not saying that there's not a principle of causation. I'm just saying that that became the skeptical challenge. And for the most part, philosophy, especially since the Enlightenment, has pretty much become skeptical and kind of given up on a lot of these metaphysical principles, except for a few holdouts. But I'm going to make a different type of argument with the cosmological argument. And I'm going to say that the principle of causation, not reasoning back through a chain or some, dependence chain or whatever kind of chain to some first event, I'm going to say that the principle of causation itself is necessary to have knowledge at all in this world. In other words, rational, true belief that can be justified, that you can make sense of the world, relies on things like what we call the principle of induction, or the idea that nature will be regular over time such that you can study it in a meaningful way and make deductions about it. Well, that's a principle that is itself not physical or material. And it's very closely connected to this idea of causation, cause and effect. Now, again, we don't see under a microscope the law of identity or the principle of cause and effect or the law of causation or the uh, regularity of nature. We observe events and then we give it that interpretation. But if those principles aren't real principles, if we're not actually discovering and learning these metaphysical laws of the universe, then we can't actually have a coherent, rational view of the world. Our view would be arbitrary and not justified. It would just be my assertion, your assertion, and we don't really know if these bubblings up of chemicals coming out of our mouths actually have any meaningful reference in the external world. In fact, as many of the philosophers of this time noted, we don't even really know, or can we prove that there is an external world. We know there's a lot of sensations coming into our eyes, to our cornea, etc. But we don't know if that's coming from an external world. Maybe it's just information that imprints upon our senses, and it's not some commonly shared external world. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm saying that there's no immediate self-evident way to know whether that is or isn't true without a different type of argumentation. And that's really what I'm getting at here with this line of argumentation, is that it's a different line of argumentation. It's arguing from the philosophy principles themselves and saying, okay, we might doubt these. We might be skeptical about them. We might say, okay, there's no principle of causation. We just can't know. If there is, who knows? But if you take that position, it has necessary implications for the rest of your beliefs and your worldview. For example, you wouldn't be able to link what's happening now to the things that happened in the past. Remember, there's no direct link or causation. There's no necessary connection between the past and the future. You don't know if your memories have any relationship to the present. In fact, you don't know if there even is a thing called the past or the future. There's only what is an immediate phenomena or epiphenomena. And even that, we don't even know that that's meaningful. It might just be an illusion. Now, you might think that's silly, but there's millions, perhaps billions of people in other world religions that actually believe that this reality is a dream or an illusion. There's many New Agers who believe that. And I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying there's nothing that necessarily tells us by having an experience that it was a meaningful experience of the external world. Those things are assumed. Now, I agree that there is an external world. I agree that we assume those things. But where I disagree is the means by which we justify or give an account for or explain our worldviews. See, I think, and I believe, and I can show, I think, that worldviews operate as a whole. It's a web of beliefs, a network of beliefs that we have. It's a thing that we read the world through like glasses. Our worldview is like our glasses, like in They Live, right? When Rowdy Piper puts on the glasses and they see the world the way it truly is. Likewise, our worldviews work that same way. And these philosophical principles are kind of the architecture or the words that we use to describe the logic or the operating system that we have operating not just in our mind, but the operating system of the world itself that we're tapping into and learning about. Now, again, you could be skeptical and say, well, but we don't know any of that. How can we prove any of that? Well, one way to prove it is to do it indirectly through what's called an indirect argument, an argument from the impossibility of the contrary, to say, all right, well, if we deny the principle of causation, how can we link any meaningful event to any other meaningful event? In fact, we're going to get to meaning in just a second. There's no such thing ultimately as meaning in that kind of a worldview. And let's take a look at another principle here that I think also ties into this, and that's the principle of teleology. This means purpose, and do things have an actual intentionality and a purpose, both in their beginning and in their end? Maybe there are no intentionalities or purposes in the world other than arbitrary human purposes. But humans are finite. Humans come and go. How do we know that those finite meanings actually have any universal, eternal meaning? When you think about something like the word truth, right? When you say, well, this is true. Well, is it true in the past? It seems like it would be, right? It's true that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, right? Or at least we think so. But is it still true today? Will it still be true forever? And this is an interesting argument that Leibniz makes about the eternality of truth. There's an interesting notion here, an idea that truth seems to suggest eternality, something beyond the mere temporal. If we think about things like mathematical principles, laws of logic, right? The law of identity, etc. Those things seem to suggest a kind of fundamental necessity for language, for meaning, for conveying meaning. So this means that these principles, even though they're not immediately findable under a microscope or testable in a lab, like causation or like teleology, it means these principles have to kind of be the case, or else we're in a position where there's no knowledge, no science, no logic, no math, no nothing. In other words, we're not saying that you can't do those things, right? There's plenty of mathematicians who probably doubt these things. The point is that you can't give an account for or ground or give a justification for those principles that you're using because you're also believing in a worldview that denies and rejects those things. So that's kind of what what I'm getting at with using some of these older argumentation, like the teleological argument or the cosmological argument. I'm saying that there's more than this because we can actually say these principles are real and they point to God, but they point to God in a different way than the way that you might suspect. And what do I mean by that? Well, all of these principles utilize or are connected to the notion of logos, or the notion of reason, discourse, or explanation. In the history of philosophy, sometimes logos in ancient Greek philosophy was connected to the notion of law or logi, or the meaning of a thing. And if you think about it, all of these principles, whether it's causation or teleology or ethics or whatever, if they do exist, then they have meaning. If they're meaningful, then they in some way relate to reason and to logic. Think about the principle of reasoning itself, or think about the principle of the human faculty of reasoning, the faculty that we have to be able to reasonably conclude this or that. If reason isn't a thing, then reason and rationality are impossible. But the problem is that reason isn't a thing that you can find under a microscope. Reason isn't reducible to chaotic, ever changing atoms and molecules. Just like the idea of the eternality of truth, if you reduce truth to matter and physicality, well, it seems like once the physical atoms of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, since they're no longer around anymore, the event has come and gone. It seems like the truth has also come and gone. So now, truth, meaning, etc., all of these things in a physicalist, materialist worldview, that means reducing everything just to matter, would then ultimately make the entire world, the entire universe, and thus, by extension, your life and your entire expressions that you speak, also meaningless, irrational, and incoherent. They might appear to you to be meaningful and coherent, but in the other aspects of your worldview where you're a materialist, you're actually negating the possibility of meaningful sentences. And so that's why I was saying that things like meaning and words and concepts also kind of end up getting denied or destroyed in a worldview where you don't have these metaphysical principles. Now, if we raise the bar a little bit and we say, all right, we've got these basic metaphysical ideas, maybe math and numbers and logic and reasoning and logos and all these things are actual philosophical principles, but what are they? Where are they? Well, they don't really seem to be reducible to matter, right? And so this would be one of the first indicators that we have that as theists, for example, we would say that there are immaterial things that exist. There's immaterial things like universal laws of logic, universal laws of mathematics, or universals themselves. Now, what are those? Where are those? Well, they might be a little bit difficult to define. It's like saying define the number 7. Well, it's not 6 and it's not 8. It's in between, but that doesn't really tell us what it is. So asking for some sort of rigid, explicit definition of things like sets or numbers or laws of logic is a little bit challenging, but we wouldn't conclude that they don't exist because they're a little bit fuzzy. They're, again, things that are kind of necessary for knowledge, but they're not themselves the direct purview of science or empirical investigation. So these things point us beyond just the material to the immaterial. Now, if there's an immaterial, and if the immaterial is kind of the ground of the material, right? Because think about it, all these things happening are within this logical framework and structure of a universe that has these principles of metaphysics and teleology, et cetera, operating within it. But also, you can't find any specific place where these principles are. So, how would we ground them if they're the logical structure of this universe itself? Well, it turns out in a theistic paradigm, you have the idea of divine conceptualism, that all the things that exist come from and are grounded in the divine mind. In other words, there is an omniscient, intentional, that's purposive, universal being who is personal, who created this world out of his own goodness, to then give other beings a share in the being and life that that being has. We call that God, but for us, this is the Orthodox Christian Trinitarian God, specifically this principle of logos or reasoning that pervades the universe is the second person of the Godhead, Jesus. Now, we're not going to focus on the Trinity in this topic. We'll get to that in another analysis video. I also have another analysis video where I went into a lot of depth about this. But right now, we're just sort of focusing on the logical and the philosophical elements of this and what these things point to. So, if you look at a book that taps into a lot of mathematicians' ideas and physicists' ideas, written by a guy named Paul Davies, I recommend this book, The Mind of God, because what he points out is that the universe, it exemplifies all these principles, not just logical philosophical principles, but also these ideas like mathematics and numbers and geometry and form and shape and uh, you know uh, even things like design, perhaps. But how do we know that, and how would we ground that? Well, he makes an argument that mathematicians have even discovered things like Mandelbrot sets, which point to something beyond merely the physical, namely because the mathematics of Mandelbrot sets are so fantastical and so almost infinite that you can zoom in. And the only way that we knew this was when we had computers that were able to zoom in to these really high degrees. So if you look up Mandelbrot sets, you'll notice, for example, that you can zoom in to extremely high levels of depth. But we needed computers with the processing power to actually see that. And these mathematical structures demonstrate regular patterns, which are not the product of human minds. So what this means is that mathematics clearly is not something created by the human mind, but it's something discovered. And that's a key point in the book that I think he cites Roger Penrose, noting that he realized when he got deep into mathematics that it's not a human creation, it's a human discovery. That's a very different, that's a very big, huge gap, because a lot of atheist materialists would say numbers, mathematics, that's things that humans just create. Well, it's more so like physics or something where you discover something, not something that you arbitrarily create. Because there's rules and patterns that go beyond the finitude of the human mind. And that's why Mandelbrot sets are such a strong example of something like this, and really point beyond the mere particular or the mere finite human mind and the limited human experience that can't even conceive of all the infinite sort of variations of the patterns within a Mandelbrot set. Well, what that suggests then is that our world has an imprinting, an information code behind it, and we now know that, for example, from DNA, that the very depths of our being are encoded with information. In fact, there's even theories that light itself in the world encodes information. That means that if you look at a discipline like information science, for example, in that discipline, there's never a situation where there's meaningful information without a meaningful informer or a meaningful mind. And so the nature of reality itself, the nature of DNA itself, our nature, suggests a very high level, almost like a computer program. But I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying that we live in a simulation, I'm not believing sim theory. I'm simply saying that there's a close analogy between the way that a computer works or a virtual world works to how our world is structured. And just like all the complexity of a virtual world, if you think about it, it has a designer, human designer behind it. It mirrors the complexity, the information coding and structure of our world. Thus, it has a divine mind as its designer, coder, creator, purpose, and end, or telos, its purpose at the end, its end goal. And so that principle, if it's true, I grant many of you are going to say, oh, it's not true, that doesn't prove anything, we don't know that. Well, if it is, it does give an account for, it does make sense of our world and how it works, and how we can have meaning, how we can have science, how we can have logic, how we can have math, how we can have ethics. In a world where none of that exists, those principles and those philosophical things also kind of disappear. And so this is, in short, a roundabout kind of introductory idea to different ways that you can tweak the transcendental argument for God, and points to other things, or pretty much kind of anything. You can actually make the transcendental argument in a roundabout way using any kind of thing. Another interesting book that points in this direction is Quadrivium. And the book talks about how nature itself and reasoning itself doesn't just assume things like logic, it also assumes things like the first 10 digits. And in our uh, Arabic numeral system, we base all of the other digits right on the first 10, right? So every digit is some variation on the first 10 digits. And this book argues that there's a kind of almost sacred number geometry. And I'm not trying to get too woo woo here because I don't mean it in a new age sense, but I mean it in a sense of like classical geometry. If you think about things like unity, or what the philosophers called the monad. And then you think about how you get from the one through counting by division, duality, that's two. And then out of that, you get another division of the triad, or three. And then out of this, you get eventually the tetractys, or the first 10 integers or mathematical principles that basically make up all of our other mathematical principles. And that isn't something that we just invented, it's something that we discover. And the world seems to mirror and be built on that same principle of order, number, and universal laws and fixities. Now, how do we know that? Well, again, we don't and can't know that merely by empirical investigation, because when I investigate the world empirically, I don't see a universal principle. I don't see a law of logic. I don't see the number seven. And so, again, just because I don't immediately physically, empirically see it, can't be a defeater or a proof against a thing, because there's all kinds of things that we all believe in, like the past or other countries that are not presently in our immediate sense data perception. And we don't irrationally think, well, those things don't exist because I don't see them, right? Now, some philosophers might have doubted those things, but unless you want to take an extremely skeptical position, then really the only rational position here is the Christian theistic position. And in the next one, I'll explain more so as to how I think it relates to things like triad. But I think you get the idea here for atheists and agnostics, or for materialists, or for people kind of looking at trying to understand logical argumentation, or numbers, or so forth, that might prove God. I think when we look at things like DNA, when we look at things like Fibonacci sequence, or when we look at things like number in the world, geometry, et cetera, when we look at laws of logic, et cetera, they point us to a divine mind, and it can't be a finite divine mind because it has to be able to string all of those pearls together, all of these universal principles like teleology and causation and laws of logic, et cetera. They have to all kind of be operant everywhere. And if the divine mind isn't everywhere or omniscient, well, then there's places where it doesn't work, right? But that would defeat the system if there's places where there's no laws of logic, or there's only pure chaos, etc. We wouldn't have a basis for rationality because we would no longer have universal principles, right? So hopefully you get the idea here then that these are the immaterial things that themselves relate to and interlock with one another, these philosophical preconditions or principles, metaphysics, etc., and that those things themselves have to be grounded in some way, and they're grounded, I'm arguing, in logos, or in the mind of God. If you like this video, hit like and share, and also suggest some things below that you think either back up or perhaps challenge this line of argumentation, and I will try to address them in the near future. Also, you can share this with others and let them know about this channel. Turn on the notifications. Be sure and head over to chalk.com, CHOQ.com, and use the promo code J60Life, that's JAY60LIFE, to get 60% off all those great products for getting healthy and getting well.